Hello witches, and welcome back to Activist Witches, where we discuss witchcraft
and activism.
You can call me Isha, my pronouns are she, they.
You can call me Raven, my pronouns are she, they.
And in today's video, we're going to discuss approaching Kemetism, an ancient Egyptian pagan religion, as someone that has Egyptian heritage, but not Egyptian culture, because I'm half Egyptian, half Italian, and I was raised in Italy. I've never even been to Egypt, but
I have twice.
So we're gonna discuss that, and do not expect this to be a video of answers. This is gonna be a video of questions, like we're asking you what you think, because personally I've had hesitance.
And we thought that this was a really valuable point to make a video in this process. Like, normally if you see us talk on a subject, it's because we've been researching it for a long time. We've come to our conclusions and we want to present them to you. You don't often get YouTube videos where someone's like, okay, I'm a bit stuck. Anyone else got any ideas? Because yeah, we genuinely would love to hear people's thoughts on this.
But before we get started, let me remind you that I've opened a Ko-fi, which is an alternative to Patreon that takes less from creators. And on there, you can support me with a one-off donation, a monthly donation, and you can even buy a tarot reading with me, Italian style. The low-income option starts at £5. And if you decide to support me there, thank you so very much. Right, we have some points that basically are questions that we're gonna ask you. We're gonna put together the argumentation, the things that we have doubts about, and you tell us. The first point, as mentioned, is I have had a lot of encouragement by the witchcraft community to look and dig into my Egyptian heritage, because it's quite literally in my blood. At the same time, it's literally only in my blood.
Yeah, does that add any authority to the things that you say just because you have that biological connection to the land, even if, I mean, we have absolutely no reason to suspect that you have any cultural links or lineage that would lead back to ancient Egypt?
Not at all, and if anything, my cultural connections are negatives. We'll go in that. On the one issue, is in my blood, therefore I'm entitled. I will bring one of the activist sides of our research, in the sense that this could connect to cultural appropriation, which is something that I have meant to do a video about, because it's something that we experience in the witchcraft community, and this could be a way that it connects to that. The entire concept of cultural appropriation comes with the idea that you go and take something from a culture that is being marginalized and minoritized, and you just pick and choose what it's convenient for you without having a connection to that. Because that's something that colonialism has done, and in a way it's most of what we have of pre-Islam, so pagan Egyptian culture. Everything that we know and everything that we have has come to us through the colonial lens, mainly of the Victorians, which were white and British, mostly. French as well. So the first point would be, I guess I could claim access without too much trouble to Kemetism, just because I suffer the marginalization of being Arab, of being half Egyptian, so I might as well take the positives and dig into my heritage. However, I do lack cultural references to Egypt. Ironically, I've never been to Egypt, but you have.
Yep, I've been once when I was 13, no, I don't know what age I was, in my teens. But yeah, one time I was to Cairo. So I got to see the pyramids, and I got to go to the Cairo Museum and see the actual mummies and in the sarcophagus and all these relics that, oh yeah, this is one point we had an argument in our relationship, because I'd seen the Rosetta Stone in the Museum of Cairo, but the real one is in the British Museum. So you were talking about having gone to touch Rosie, like the oldest thing that you could put your hands on to be connected to that time. And I was like, no, it's in Cairo. Like, what do you mean? I saw it in Cairo. No, Cairo has a replica of the Rosetta Stone, whereas Britain has the real one.
Which going to the colonial references, like you kind of get why there's a bit of an issue there.
That is the thing. Like a lot of the culture in Cairo is geared towards tourism. It's a specific lens that they shine on themselves to make themselves more consumable, so the tourists come and they spend money, and it's very profitable, but it becomes inauthentic.
Which actually brings a second point to this. So taking pride in the heritage, so let's resume the pagan pantheon and religion that there was in pre-Islam Egypt. Despite of where the sources come and the fact that there is a colonial lens, let's do this. How has Kemet and Kemetism been done so far? So for what we looked into, it's a reconstructionist movement that started in the 70s. Ironically, it started in America. It started in America because rightfully, and I say this like genuinely, black people in America, some black people in America, understood that Christianity was a means of control. We discussed it in the last video that we made on the 7 deadly sins. On the sloth part, it was explained how Christian indoctrination was presented to the slaves as a way to control them and convince them to work hard for nothing. So I do completely appreciate that there needs to be a standing up against Christianity, especially by people who have been at the receiving end of Christian indoctrination for control. The special issue with being at the receiving end of this missionary work, basically, missionary in colonies and then indoctrination within America during slavery, is that the people that are now here usually are those that are descendants of people that complied, because otherwise they wouldn't be alive to have children and have come here. That is a huge issue that I personally see, and that's the reason why I appreciated the existence of Kemetism as let's go and dig in our heritage. It's necessary to rebel to what has been imposed on us.
Because you get these two very different viewpoints of Africa coming out of the Victorian times. You have one of Victorian explorers going to sub-Saharan Africa, and they talk about tribes people and the primitive way of learning, and they bring families from sub-Saharan Africa and put them in zoos in London to as if they were animals. But at the same time, you have ancient Egypt coming out, which is this grand empire that spanned over 3,000 years. And so, in a sense, the reconstructivist Kemetism that we get in America was kind of an attempt to take the glory of the Egyptian empire, make it the ownership of the continent of Africa, as opposed to this very kind of Victorian English idea of things. But at the same time, it kind of came with certain justifications for it. There's certain revisions to actual history that come forward, and part of the issue is that when you have a subculture that arises in opposition to a main culture, it ends up being trapped by it. It can only exist in reference to that culture. Culture makes subculture, subculture makes culture. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a subculture. It would just be a different culture. So yeah, there's a lot of, I guess, using the methods that have been used on them because they're very effective. Yeah. To create this very empowered movement. But yeah, there's a few people who then kind of have looked into the history of things and realized that a lot of what is taught as what happened with ancient Egypt and how Christianity rose then in the first and second millennia, yeah, not necessarily. And I suppose that is one of the points is that when we were at the, what was it, the Welsh Occult Conference, and we've mentioned it before, Mara Starling had a fantastic talk there. And yeah, she went through the 3 different kinds of approaches that we tend to have to paganism and witchcraft. So kind of taking it from a British perspective then, you'd have the reconstructivists, which are trying to look at druidic practices. So if it's thousands of years old, the more thousands of years older it is,
better.
the more authentic and better it is. Everything was true in the past and it's been distorted and ruined since.
And you need to do it now as it was done then to be
Yeah.
authentic, otherwise
So you have to find
you're
it.
messing it up.
There's many details, even though the cultural context has completely changed, but that's the way it was done then, so that's the only way that we should be doing it. Then there's, what's the other two?
Folk,
Yeah, so the folk practices are much more looking at superstitions throughout cultures. So yeah, if we were going to take that same view over Egypt, then we'd be looking at much more Arabic diaspora
Yeah.
superstitions. So things like the jinn, things like shaitans. Yeah, the beings that are made out of fire and light,
Yeah.
fire and smoke.
which have then been absorbed into the Abrahamic side of religion, so into Islam. But
Yeah, but in the
it's
same way,
yeah.
but in the same way that with folk magic here in the UK, so any practices that were done might have been based off of pagan deities that we
Yeah.
had before that got passed down and then got turned into saints.
So Bridget is a great example of that, actually.
Yeah.
Bridget, the deity, becomes Bridget the saint because the Abrahamic religion need to absorb and syncretize, but then claim.
And while there may be saints that take from ancient Rome or ancient Greece deities, or at least their equivalents, because in Mesopotamia, whether it's in Europe or Scandinavia, there's a lot of these same ideas of what the gods are that are, again, syncretized across the continents. So some of them have been turned into saints, some of them have been completely discarded. But yeah, apart from then the ones that are syncretized in ancient Egypt with ancient Greece and ancient Rome, which are all kind of going on around about the
Yeah.
same time, we don't really know of how that's been kept rolling, how it's kept moving throughout culture.
I have the suspicion that everything that we know today about pre-Islam pagan Egypt is not, we just don't have enough information to know how it worked before, so everything has been a revision of what we have, and what we have again comes from a colonialist lens.
On the other hand, though, the last point of Mara is the more eclectic
Yeah.
style, which is do whatever works.
If it works, do it.
So yeah, honestly, if there are people out there that have chosen Egyptian deities and they speak to you and they send you messages and you feel that that relationship is working for you, then
Ultimately, who are we to say otherwise?
Exactly.
The only thing that I would consider is a very good point that you brought. One, there is an issue between the let's reclaim black ancient Africa as the mother of all, which, yes, we all come from there. And so let's make Kemetism this rebellion towards the system of oppression that was within Christianity. Yes, amazing. There are offshoots that can be negative of that, and I think some of that has been shown into the pharaonism of current national movements in Egypt, which I didn't know was a thing, but give people a chance and they will find a way to reduce themselves in smaller groups so that they're still an oppressor and an oppressee, which is problematic. I don't like something that is worth mentioning, and then if you want eventually we'll go into. Do not ever think that any time that I talk about racism I just think that white people can be racist. That's absolutely not the case.
it depends on the power, on who's in power.
There's the point of intersectionality is power relations. And that being said, there's the other side of the coin of, let's take Kemetism because there was this amazing, powerful empire, and then after the Arab Springs, that has been taken by the nationalists, so the far right of Egypt, as this idea that, see, we were better and we should dominate everyone because we were the best part of Africa. No, you missed the point.
Which again, so we were watching a documentary the other day on the Kingdom of Nubia, or the Lost Kingdom of Nubia, which is kind of extending from Sudan up to
Egypt, which was the southern part of Egypt.
And if you actually look at then the history between those two, you have these two dominant cultures in this region of Africa. Let alone the cultures that were elsewhere on the continent. And there's cultural exchange between them, like there's the Nubians have their own gods, the Egyptians have their own gods, then there's some crossover between the two. The one conquered the other, then one conquered back. So you have this dynasty of Egyptian pharaohs where they were the Nubian took over Egypt and then became the pharaoh of Egypt and Nubia because they had the two snakes on the crown, and that's kind of missing from the Kemetic and the pharaohism.
There's also a huge issue, especially in the part of nationalism that Egypt currently has in pharaohism. We have these ideas that we try to apply retroactively on the matters of race. If you think the race and the concept of different races have always existed, you would be wrong. Those weren't a thing before the 1600s. The 1600s were crucial because slavery.
Not true.
Well, yeah.
No, there's it works differently, but I sent you an article on this. But I don't think you got a chance to read it. It starts in the medieval, so we're talking like 6th century to 13th century. But it was on gender lines. So the darker skinned you were, the more masculine you were. The lighter skinned you were, the more feminine you were.
That still is the truth. That still applies to the way that racism applies to gender, applies to fatness.
Yeah, so that it's taken a diversion around that very sort of like white supremacist idea of race, but at the very least, skin color was discriminated against.
There is actually, you probably have seen it if we're talking about Egypt. There is a representation that is assigned to be from ancient Egypt with 4 different skin-colored people. And there's the claim that, see, they saw race at the time as well. All Egyptologists are like, they don't see race like we see race. That wasn't a thing, it was a multicultural place. But that way, the Libyan is supposed to be white, the Nubians are black, the Asians are yellowish, and then the Egyptians are reddish brown. The peculiar thing is that all that I find of that depiction actually is a replica from the 1800s. So if you have information of where the original should be and come from, I would be delighted to find out, because otherwise I have the vague feeling that this reproduction from the 1800s is indeed revisionist, in the sense that, again, then the modern concept of races comes from the 1600s, and had this vague idea that sometimes North Africans were considered Caucasians, or sometimes they were considered second step from Caucasians.
It depends on who had the technological advancement. So Indians become white because they were very advanced in society. But the second that you want to put an order then on who gets to rule India, they're not so white anymore.
Yeah, no, exactly. There's the natural history that was written in 1700s by a French author. And yeah, the division of races there is basically the foundation, the cornerstone that we understand of race now, even if it's absolutely incorrect. And if we want to talk of race genetically, we're all part of the human race, and that's just a dimorphism, basically, of how we adapted to the territory. But that's where that comes from. And there's a very good chance that, in ancient Egypt, the concept wasn't there the way that we understand it today. So the fact that a variation of Kemetism has been taken as pharaohism, and then we are better than the rest of Africa because we're Egyptian, problematic in it. On the last point that I have, there's the Wicca attitude, for what I understand. Somebody, thank you, I don't know who you were because it was an anonymous question, but thank you. Somebody in the Q&A asked me, how do you feel about Wicca and the fact that basically it's a pick and choose religion in terms of where you get your references, and it's okay to pick a deity from the Norse pantheon, one from the Egyptian pantheon. How do you feel about that? And as mentioned before, there could be a lot of cultural appropriation, potentially. Wicca doesn't quite seem to care about that. That's also the reason why you very often see white sage used without anyone batting an eyelash, but that's kind of problematic.
And in a way, this becomes a defensive mechanism because it's so individualized. If one sect of Wicca does something problematic, the rest of everyone else can just push themselves away from it. It's like, oh, that's just them, that's not everyone.
Because it's by nature very eclectic. Like, it has been born as this, let's go back to the old religion, but realistically it picks something from Hermetic stuff which came from ceremonial magic of the late 1800s, Golden Dawn and stuff, and then there was picking from folk magic. Like, I understand why it's indeed a pick and choose. As I mentioned before, one side of me is like, should you pick from something that is not closed? Because that's the thing about not having uninterrupted information that gets to us from pre-Islam Egypt about their pagan religion. Like, anything that was there before, no matter how much we try to reconstruct, that has been lost. With the information that we have, we can try to do something today and for how we adapt and understand, but the simple fact that there was an interruption of centuries makes the point of whatever was actually done back then that is lost, that we don't understand completely, and we just have the information that have got to us. Some of that didn't even come to us directly from the people that were practicing.
I mean, again, if we're completely wrong on this fact, please do load the comments up with sources, because we'd really actually like to find them.
Like, that is what has given me hesitancy about embracing this. And as I mentioned at the beginning, and I'll briefly go into it, there's this last thing about cultural references. So, because I have been raised in Italy, despite the racism that I've always faced, because I was the only person of color in my village, I was the only person of color in my entire elementary school, this goes on. So, despite the fact that I wasn't treated like an Italian, a pure-blood Italian, I was also raised just with a cultural reference. I didn't quite have contacts with my father or my father's side of the family, because my parents separated when I was really young. All the information that I have and touch me culturally about Egypt are not positives. And to go very in short from my perspective, all that I know and that touches me somewhat personally about Egypt is that my grandmother, having been raised throughout the first half of the 1900s in Egypt, indubitably underwent female genital mutilation, which, despite having been made illegal, was still present in Egypt to 95% of the population in the early noughties. That is a huge issue, and it doesn't escape my attention that that is part of my heritage. The second point is something that I know directly of my family, which is my aunt, which also was Italian and married to my father's brother. The moment that she got pregnant, she was taken to Egypt on the alleged promise of a holiday that lasted 3 years, so that she had 2 babies there that then were raised within Islam, and she was, to all effects, kidnapped for 3 years. So, far from making this a justification from Islamophobia, but it's an issue of my own family, blood and heritage. And when you have that kind of conflict within your own family, that becomes an issue to reclaim that kind of heritage, because despite the fact that I have trouble with my mother as well, at least on my Italian side, I have my grandparents. They were amazing people. They raised me best that they could, being white people, having to handle a mixed-race child. Unfortunately, not having a connection to Egypt didn't allow me to have something or someone to latch onto that could be positive. And I need to stress this because I don't want to give excuses for Islamophobia based on what I said. The special thing about Islam is that it gets interpreted a lot. Everything that you get from the Quran is not the sacred book the way that the Bible is. It is, but then it's down to the
scholars.
To the scholars to interpret. So the fact that my family specifically decided to go hardcore that way on FGM and on the misogyny, that is an issue of my family. That is not an issue of Islam at large. I need to stress this out.
But there is a point which is you are worried about going to Egypt, because if your father is quite often watching in ways that we don't understand, there's times when he's left comments that have sort of pointed out that he's been paying attention longer than we realized. So could we get there unscathed? Maybe, but it's a risk not worth taking.
So that being said, you can gather that there are conflictual feelings and information that I have on the matter of Chemeticism, ancient Egypt, and as a pagan witch, do I want to dip my toes, or can I? Am I allowed? Is it fair for me to dip my toes in ancient pagan Egypt and the way that it's been repurposed for the present time, which is Chemeticism?
I mean, the interesting thing here is that it's actually becoming more complicated because of your personal links. Because you have personal feelings, you have personal history with this stuff, whereas someone in America who has absolutely no connection to it has no friction, there's no personal issues to come into, there's no feelings to explore. Maybe they should think about it a bit more than maybe they are, but...
I think there's definitely a point of, if you are just a white person or a person of another heritage and you have this attraction to a specific deity from the ancient Egyptian pantheon, do you actually need to go to that pantheon, or is there a syncretization that actually is closer to you that might be worth exploring? And if you don't think about that, what is the fascination with Egypt specifically without a connection?
Yeah, and it's always been... We were discussing the other day how with ancient Rome and ancient Greece, and even places like ancient Mesopotamia with goddesses like Inanna, that we have plays, we have poems, we have stories that we reconstruct and we tell to this day. We still make Greek tragedies. For Egyptian culture, though, when it comes to media, it's The Mummy. Or that one terrible Gods of Egypt movie with Jamie Lannister.
So these are our doubts and wonders. So what do you think? Putting yourself in our shoes, what would you do? Or do you actually know and understand Chemeticism better than we know and have had access to? So in that regard, do send us sources and please do educate us, because this is the point of this video. These are our thoughts and
Current
doubts.
thoughts, yeah.
If you give us more information, we're more than happy to change our mind, because just people that are silly never change their mind given new information.
Yeah.
That being said, I hope that this video was, if not useful, interesting and might start a discussion. And until next time, I hope that we can hex the colonial patriarchy together, because there's need for it.